Okay, today we take another look at the New Testament canon, and this time at the Pauline Epistles, those letters written by Paul, Apostle Paul. All right, and those books of the Bible fall between Acts and James. Acts, we have the Gospels, we have Acts, then we have the Pauline Epistles, and then after that we have the universal letters and Apocalypse. Okay, so we begin in the group of Pauline Epistles. We begin with Paul's letters to the churches, the assemblies, beginning with Romans. There are two letters to the church in Corinth, and the letter to the Galatians, letter to the Ephesians, letter to the Philippians, letter to the Colossians, and two letters to the church in Thessalonica. Now, if we take a look at the Ephesians, letter to the Ephesians, letter to the Philippians, letter to Colossians, and the letter to Philemon, which we haven't mentioned yet, those are called the captivity epistles because Paul wrote them while he was locked up. Now, Paul did not write all this literature. I mean, the majority, total of 14 letters, the majority of books in the New Testament are considered to be authored by Paul. But Paul did not author all these letters without help. He had also the assistance of Silvanus and Timothy and Tychicus and possibly Luke. He also got some kind of assistance with Demas, but usually Silvanus and Timothy were acting as his scribes or writing some portions of their own. But whatever the case, all these books, these letters, are considered divinely inspired. So the primary author is God. He is the primary author of Scripture. Okay, so after the letters written to the churches, to the assemblies, we have 3 letters written to bishops. 2 letters to Timothy, 1 letter to Titus, and giving guidelines. Paul's giving guidelines on how to conduct themselves as bishops, and guidelines for consecrating other bishops. What we're looking for in bishops. Okay, following that, we have Paul's letter to Philemon on behalf of Philemon's former slave, Onesimus. Onesimus was a runaway slave. He ran to Paul because he remembered Paul's kindness when Paul would visit the assembly at Philemon's house. Philemon would host a house church. And so Paul writes on Onesimus' behalf and asked for Philemon to show charity toward Onesimus, who, in his absence, had become a believer, become a Christian, thanks to Paul's influence. So Philemon does that very thing. Philemon gives Onesimus his freedom and his blessing. And tradition tells us that Onesimus personally delivers Paul's letter to the Colossians, together with companion Tychicus. So together, Onesimus and Tychicus take Paul's letter to the church in Colossae. And tradition also tells us that Onesimus becomes bishop of Colossae. And tradition also tells us, because none of this is actually written down in the Bible, tradition tells us that Philemon and his wife Appia and their son Archippus are all martyred for the faith. So the only one left to survive is Onesimus. Okay, so after all these, we have Paul's letter to the Hebrews. Now, his authorship has since been called into question, but traditionally, and this has been the tradition for centuries, Hebrews has been attributed to Paul. Well, in the other letters, right, Paul acknowledges his authorship. In Hebrews, he does not. No one does. So, but here's the thing. There is in Christian works and Christian writings a tradition of anonymity. of anonymous works, writing things and not putting your name to it. And this is Paul's anonymous work. It's no one else's anonymous work. Paul wrote this. And we can tell that Paul wrote this because of his very knowledgeable. He shares with his audience, the Hebrews, a common background in Hebrew scripture, Jewish customs, Jewish literature. Paul had studied under Gamaliel, and that influence, Gamaliel's influence, shows in the letter to the Hebrews. Hebrews is also part of what I call a divine treatise on the Eucharist. So we combine Hebrews with Revelations, and we have a divine treatise on the Eucharist. Okay, so now letters to the Galatians. The church in Galatia is in Zoroastrian country. That's the place where the wise men, the astrologer kings, came from to visit the baby Jesus in Bethlehem. By the time they arrived, Joseph had built a house for his family, the Holy Family, and that's where the wise men met them. Now, traditionally, we talk about three wise men. We have the celebration of the so-called three wise men, Melchior, Balthazar, and what's the other one? And anyway, the reason three wise men were chosen, three names were chosen, is to correspond with the three featured gifts that they brought to the baby: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which have a very special significance, which we won't get into here. But the actual number of wise men or astrologer kings that came on that trip from Galatia to Bethlehem were 8. There were 8 of them, and they brought many more gifts besides the ones that are mentioned. The ones that are mentioned have very special significance. That's why they're mentioned. But they brought the typical gifts one brings to a newborn king, including various foods and jewels and what have you. So let's see, what else do we want? Oh yeah, the church in Corinth was made up of very well-to-do Christians, and there was a problem in the church acknowledged in the first letter, and the second letter acknowledged that the Corinthians had dealt with that problem and that things were better. Okay.